Thanks for joining us. This is The Economy. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Well, 2026 is well underway, and of course, while we're still trying to figure out what is to expect from 2026, we might want to do a review of 2025 as well and do a quick recap. Here to talk this and more is Ooi Kok Hin, the political and policy analyst. Kok Hin, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah,
Let's talk a little bit more in terms of what you think 2025 worked and what didn't work. And if you had to sum up Malaysia's economy and governance landscape in 2025 in one sentence, what would be your review on this?
Thanks, Ibrahim. I think maybe the question for me, the sentence would be a year of experimentation. You are seeing that the government perhaps increasingly confident with its majority, and they start to take some experimentation. For example, we see Budi 95, the fuel subsidy rationalization that is, hopefully rolling, is something that multiple governments, consecutive governments have been talking about it, or the Prime Minister talk about it, but to actually execute it is a different matter, right? And I think the government is slowly implementing steps, putting mechanism in place to ensure that if and when the time comes, they can roll out that rationalization. I would say, if you look at SARA as well, the 100 ringgit monthly aid for Malaysians through the e-Kasih, extremely poor households, I think that is a good policy as well. Of course, it's questionable. I think some critics have mentioned that if there's one-off announcement, 100 ringgit to everybody, I think if such a universal blanket policy, if you have a broad tax base, you boleh lakukan, kan? Universal tax benefits, universal basic income. But if you don't have a broad tax base, it may make sense to limit it, target it to, let's say for example the B40, and maybe give them more than 100 ringgit, for example, rather than you give 100 ringgit to some T20 people, which is not even enough to fuel their very expensive cars and so on. However, I understand the rationale to do universal blanket policy, where in some countries they tax the rich quite high, and this is what they get in return because it's a society, everybody gets the benefits. But we don't have that in Malaysia. Our tax rate is quite low. Our corporate tax, inheritance tax, for example, apa lagi, capital gains tax dan sebagainya amat kurang lah. So I think the government is struggling with that tax revenue as well.
Now, we saw the slew of announcements made by the Prime Minister at the start of the year. Mostly positive reviews, but there are detractors that say things like along the lines of these reforms come at a time when his political base is currently wavering. There's also other detractors saying that of all the political reforms, these ones, while it's nice to have, there are much more critical reforms that needs to be done. And of course, DAP, for instance, have said after the Sabah elections that they might pull out or they might rethink their position if no reforms are done in 6 months. How do you read this situation when it comes to PMX issuing these kind of reforms, including term limits for the Prime Minister and many more?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting things about political reform. You would think that, okay, let's say a political party, a coalition that comes to power, campaigning, promising reform, will implement reform. But actually, the reform doesn't happen like that. What you see in real life is reforms happen when, let's say, a government, a political party is feeling unsure about its, political stability dan sebagainya. Contoh, we have Ismail Sabri, who came in the time that, when Tan Sri Muhyiddin just lost his majority after UMNO pull out. Again, we are reliving this drama again in this time. But Ismail Sabri managed to sign an MOU with the federal opposition at the time, Pakatan Harapan, to implement several major reforms, including UD 18 constitutional amendment and implementation and so on. You also have the anti-hopping law done during Ismail Sabri's time, right? He didn't come in as someone who promised reform, but he implemented it because that was the situation. Coming back to 2025, you see that as well in when you mentioned DAP and Pakatan Harapan after the Sabah state election. There is now the urgency to act. And I think that has been missing in the first 2 or 3 years of the Madani government, right? It's, okay, how do you hold together this fragile majority? It's not a very forward-looking thing. I think in their third year, they are starting to, like I mentioned earlier, take some risk, experimentation. I think with that Sabah state election result, I think that kind of pushed them over the edge a little bit in the sense that, okay, we cannot be comfortable anymore. We have to do things. Like, whether we do or do not do things, the political situation is always changing. So might as well we try to push for the reform that we want. And in a way, it's either like you live or die by your own sword, right?
Yeah.
Rather than if you tak buat apa-apa, you die anyway, right? So I think there's that coming to terms with that political reality, and I think it's a good thing that this is the new political reality of our country.
There's also other political reforms that was announced that I would assume there wouldn't be any friction towards it. For instance, the separation of the AG and the public prosecutor. There's also elements of trying to widen the universal basic income that we speak of. One of seems to be the situation now, but the Prime Minister did not rule out further disbursements of income as well. Do you feel that that also is another element of him trying to push forward some ideas on widening the tax base that all prime ministers since I think since Najib trying to widen the tax base? These reforms take time, but do you feel that there's no bite towards coalition partners trying to make these reforms? Because only Pakatan Harapan wants these reforms, but other members within the unity government might not necessarily have that kind of feel for these kind of reforms.
Yeah. So I think we are addressing several things at the moment. So let's take a step back. When we talk about AGPP separation, I think a lot of members of the public may not be fully, be aware or support this thing. Oh, what is this about, right? Actually, it is a big change because you're talking about separating the government's lawyer, which means the lawyer that will act on behalf of the government when it comes to, let's say, somebody sue the government or the government is trying to, wrestle batu putih, for example, and the role of pendawat raya, which is the public prosecutor. The very clear case of why this is important is when certain political leaders were charged in court, and then when they win power, they instruct as the government lawyer to drop the case. So that's when you happen the conflation of the two roles. So separating it is a big step towards institutional reform, strengthening. Of course, the devil is in the details. We do not know exactly what the provision the bill will be, but this is a major step towards reform if done right. And I think we have to credit the Madani government for willing to bite the bullet on this. On the tax and fiscal and sebagainya, you were right when I think during Prime Minister Najib's time he implemented at least GST, right? It's a broader tax base, although some people will criticize it's not very progressive because everyone kena kan, whether you're poor or not, you Bali ni pun you kena dan sebagainya kan. But there are also other forms of tax that we can look at. Capital gains tax, inheritance tax, for example. I think if you earn, let's say, 5,000 ringgit a month, right, working, and then your annual income is what, perhaps 60,000 ringgit, you get tax. But if you inherit property worth millions of ringgit, suddenly you don't get tax or tax very little. I think that's a form of wealth inequality. That means inequality doesn't occur through your labor income, tapi through the assets and wealth that you own. And that's where I think the government may have to look at as well. I think it's also, I would caution also looking at certain political party or actors sebagai, they need progressive, they push for certain tax reform, but others don't. Actually, it doesn't work like that in real life. There is some people or institution that we would think is progressive, but in the back scene, they're actually the one resisting certain form of, let's say, tax wealth redistribution. These things are real, and I think perhaps what's needed is a concerted effort among the progressive in different faction party to come together and say, okay, we need to push this jointly in different our own parties dan sebagainya.
We'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more with Ooi Kok Hin. Thanks for staying on with us. I have in the studio with me Ooi Kok Hin, a political and policy analyst. Kok Hin, let's talk a little bit more about the decision shift. If 2026 could be defined by one decision shift in Malaysia's development path, and that path must be changed, what would it be, either politically, institutionally, or even culturally?
My wish list is to move away from neoliberal policy regime. And what do I mean by that is, I think since the time of Dr. Mahathir 1.0, you're starting to see Malaysia shifting towards less public government spend less public money and let private sector dan sebagainya to take over certain form of investment. I'll take one issue which is pet sleeve for me, PTPTN, student debt reform, higher education financing, right? So in the past, when you go to university, actually it's very heavily subsidized. You get a lot of derma siswa dan sebagainya to go to university. We see as a public goods, right? Maksudnya semua orang ada hak untuk menikmati pendidikan tinggi. But after the 90s, you see a creation of a loan regime di mana is the individual responsibility, bukan state responsibility to provide education, but it's on you to get a loan, and then you pinjam RM50,000 to finance your 4-year study, and then after that you may not even get a job or a proper paying job after your education, kerja Grab dan sebagainya. But Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim announced in Budget 2026 a shift from that thinking, which is very minor and pilot step, I would say, but it is quite major in terms of what its implication is. So what Prime Minister announced is the government will allocate basically free education for B40 students. That means if you go to a public university and you are from a hardcore poor background, confirm free education. I think they are benefiting about 5,000 recipients in the first year, and this is quite major. This is basically saying, it's not about whether you can afford it or not, but we believe that this is a public goods education. Your kewangan you tak okay shouldn't be a barrier for you to enjoy education. So that's a major step. Another one I want to mention is the program called Siswa Sulung. I think this is a credit to not just Anwar but the previous government under Ismail Sabri and so on. This is a program where they support first generation college students. Di mana if you are the first in your family to go to college or university, the government will financially support you. Not through loans, which you have to pay back, right? Loans is very, like individual responsibility. So I think this is a very good step towards, okay, what kind of society we want to be, right? If you are poor, if you are a need-based family, then the state, the society can support you to move out from your poverty dan sebagainya.
I don't think anybody would disagree with education and providing all the external support for that. But this is an example of a social economy where the state needs to be well endowed to begin with.
Yeah.
So it doesn't work in vacuum where you want to help out people but you don't tax people at the same time, or you can't find a way to increase your revenue. But in Budget 2026, we've seen how the revenue has actually quite dropped from year on year, either from tax collection or from other forms of revenue, such as patronage dividends, for instance. So this does provide some sort of a fiscal pressure towards the government in terms of trying to be a little bit more attentive towards helping the people, but at the same time trying to increase their revenue while ensuring that the economy grows in a stable way. My fear is that we might see a situation where, while we're trying to say reduce the deficit by 5% or something to 4% or even 3% next year or this year now, the hit will be on the development side, i.e., the building of institutions, the upkeeping of the institutions, rather than trying to grow revenue from the top side. This is what I worry. Do you have that kind of view as well, or do you think that the government has what it takes to actually achieve all these various possibilities, increasing revenue, maintaining fiscal deficit or target, or i.e. to reduce it, and to increase welfare state and get more people to benefit from this?
Yeah, I mean, you're on the right track completely. I agree with you. In the US, for example, other than whatever crisis they're going through at the moment, the US punya right-wing actors, when they want to reduce the tax and sebagainya, they don't say we are not for ending poverty dan sebagainya. They will in fact go to the tax thing that you mentioned, which is you reduce the capacity of the state to run this program. You don't go after the program themselves. You reduce the state capacity to provide this program. And that is where they come up with terms, for example, like tax relief. If you compare tax breaks, for example, they did they run labs and experiments and so on. Like how do we convince people to support the tax breaks for the rich, right? So if you say tax break, it does feel like a bit cheating, like the rich is getting a break, but you package it balik sebagai tax relief, for example. Then it's like tax is being seen as a pain, a burden imposed on rich people who deservedly got their wealth dan sebagainya. So this kind of discourse, I'm sure it's happening in Malaysia as well, and perhaps they do have more significant veto power over our policy making, right? I think maybe this is the conversation that needs to happen in 2026. In fact, maybe the second half of this decade, right? Now we are practically looking at 2026 to 2030, the second half of this decade, I think we need to look at how do we broaden revenue for the state in able to provide the kind of programs, benefits that we want the society to be.
I can tell you with certainty that that part is already there in RMK 13 to broaden the base. All eyes are on execution and implementation now. And I think that while the plan is nice to have, do you think that that execution can be done in this administration or whatever government comes after the general election? That is certainly everybody's talking about it now already. Do you think that that is the risk that you are looking at?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that risk, and I do want to talk about the whole transition of government power. Okay, if you look at Japan and Australia, for example, would you consider them developed countries with relatively functional governments?
Yeah.
Japan and Australia have so many frequent turnover of prime ministers, even more than us. We have 4 prime minister in 8 years, kita pun macam, oi dah banyak gila, politically unstable dan sebagainya. But in Japan and Australia, that's normal. And in fact, kalau serve 6-8 years is considered one of the longest tenure, right? But they have functional governments. And I think maybe this is a new reality that perhaps Malaysia can embrace, right? Change of prime minister government doesn't need to lead to political instability dan sebagainya, as long as you have functional institution and competent civil service, public service. I think, you mentioned about execution, I think we need that sort of like competent civil service dan juga institutions that are independent and autonomous that can run things regardless of the political change of the day. Having said that, of course, it's important that whoever is elected has the mandate to change things, right? Otherwise, why bother with elections if I'm voted in power and then so-called deep state will decide everything, right? I think we need to balance both sides, which is there needs to be the ability of continuity regardless of who is in power and the mandate of the people to be able to elect the kind of government they want and the policy they wish to implement.
I think that's a very aspirational way of looking at things. Are you optimistic that Malaysia will achieve that kind of balance in the near future?
I wouldn't say it's an achievement of a state. It's more of an equilibrium where you kena main tarik tali. You have to achieve a certain equilibrium. Where if you are moved too much in one side or the other, it's not good. I think again, bringing back the US example, if you move too much to the political side, then they are undercutting a lot of bureaucracy that are important to ensure certain, for example, welfare benefits is run, certain science programs, space programs is run. When you just cut it across the board, there are unintended consequences dalam economics we mentioned that the ripple effect dan sebagainya. That, for example, I think very simple one, the tariff, right? US tariff. When they impose tariff coming on from China, they actually U-turn, but they realize that actually it undercut their own industry and sector, right? It's not you're not going to target the Chinese punya ni as they intended.
Let's talk about the aspirations that you have for the people. Malaysia is a very diverse country. We're not homogeneous by any means and measure. Do you think that from language to culture to people to economic development status to geography, because of this diversity, do you think that it might be hard to get the kind of will from the people to ensure that everybody gets the most of what they want instead of just targeting a certain group of populace that might have a stronger say through the political means that they elect?
I think that would be one of the key tests for Malaysia, has been since 1957 or 1963, depending on how you count, is that whole plural society thing, right? I know I was just at a government event recently, and before they start the event, they made us all recite the preamble to Rukun Negara. And in the preamble to Rukun Negara, there is a word that lets membina masyarakat yang progresif dan liberal. And I feel like, wow, like liberal has now become like a negative connotation word in today's Malaysia, but back then it is an aspirational thing. Like we should aspire to this, we as a country. And I think, progressive liberal diversity, we perhaps have to take back those terms and recast them in a more positive light, right? That this is not something against our tradition. In fact, this is who we are as a nation since the beginning. And I think it's up to so-called progressive actors to package that narrative effectively. Maybe I will share just one story, right, about diversity and unity. Back when I was young, which is not quite long ago already, I remember reading something by a professor, the late Professor Ooi Kok Hin. He said that when you are a true Malaysian, you often feel very lonely. And I resonate with that quote as a teenager, because I feel that when you have diverse group of friends, in Malaysia, in most places in Malaysia, you're actually quite alone in that context. Well, people will normally just mingle among their ethnic group. But as I go to college, matriculasi, university, work, and play, so I realize that maybe that perspective is not entirely true. Because if you grew up in Kelantan, for example, and your 99% of your friends is Malay, that doesn't make you any less Malaysian. Similarly, if you grew up in somewhere in, Ipoh or somewhere where, it's 60%, 70% Chinese, that doesn't make you any less Malaysian as well. So the diversity part, we have to perhaps recast it as well. There's more than one road to Malaysianness, and there's more than one road to being a Malaysian society. We don't have to force everybody to be homogeneous.
Speak more on that, please, because I think that people forget that those are the origins that where we came from. Do you think that the ability for us to take back the ownership of those terms and imbue that from the people who hijack it, is that an active thinking that we must have now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Prime Minister Anwar or Madani government or any future leaders of Malaysia maybe should look up to how Tun Razak managed to do this big vision thing, right? So Tun Razak, he created new economic policy, which today some people might see as very ethnic punya policy. It's dasar bumi putra dan sebagainya. But it didn't start out as just that, right? It's not an ethnic supremacist argument. The argument is for class restructuring, poverty elimination. And to do that, he brings together very different people. He has some Malay nationalists on board. He has some Harvard professor on board, Jasfalen. He has some socialist, minority, Indian, James Puthucheary, and so on board. In fact, Tun Razak was a member of the Fabian Society with the Labour Party back when he was a student in the UK. That doesn't compromise his Malay nationalist credential. And I feel that this is perhaps the spirit that we need today. To be a nationalist, but also one that is rooted in egalitarianism. It's not in ethnic, religious ke apa. Am I making sense here?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think you need that kind of vision building embodied by Tun Razak, and also someone who can bring different people together and has a clear direction of where he want to go. Whether it's MARA, NEP, apa lagi, mention all the major institutions in Malaysia. Actually, these were brainchild of Tun Razak. And he actually was PM for only 6+ years. You don't need, PMS just announced a term limit for Prime Minister, right? You don't need 10, 20 years to be a consequential leader of this nation.
Are you feeling that we are deprived of such leaders that comes out from our fabric of society?
Yeah, I mean definitely. But to be fair, if Tun Razak were Prime Minister today, he may not have done those things as well, because the context has changed. The power that is in the Prime Minister is less now. Whether it's you're talking about political fragmentation and sebagainya lah. But I think also we don't start from a clean slate anymore. I think Tun Razak has a more blank canvas to draw, so to speak lah kan. Compared to, basically we are path dependent lah. Kalau dalam academia we call it path dependent. You dah set satu track, you are here now. You don't start from here, so you can't draw from scratch anymore. But I mean there are parallels definitely. Tun Razak started Barisan Nasional, right? From what was it, Perikatan ni kan back then. So he started Barisan Nasional. He even offered the DAP, but the DAP didn't join. But today you have unity government. There's definitely parallels involved, and I think let's not forget Tun Razak is also quite good at cultivating apprentices. So when you talk about Tengku Razali, Mahathir, back then all very young, Musa Hitam and all that, he cultivated them. And I think people often forget, Tun Razak was only in his late 20s, I think, when he was Menteri Besar Pahang, or one of the leaders lah. And early 30s when he became the Timbalan President UMNO, and basically number 2 lah in the country. Nowadays, if you are in your 30s, you'll be assigned to some pemuda role, you know. And by the time you get to top leadership level at 50, 60 years old, you're already bought in with the system. Your thinking semua dah status quo, right? You're a bit absorbed by the need. Usually, I would think people in their 30s and 40s, not to be ageist here, but from my own personal experience, they tend to shake things up. In your teenage years, early 20s, you are just learning the ropes. In your 30s and 40s, you gain enough confidence, you have enough leverage, relationship to shake things up. And I think, you know, that's why it's so exciting to see like people like Syed Saddiq when he become minister, full minister at the age of I think 25, 26, right? And that basically shake up the status quo, di mana we expect people to be in your line, wait for your turn. But when you have a full minister at 25, that's something else, right? It's a learning curve for Saddiq or anyone else for that matter. Now today we have Akmal as the Menteri taking over Rafizi's portfolio.
We have Taufik as well, KBS. He's a young guy. I think he's not even 30 yet.
Yeah. And okay, I have to mention this as well because with all the names you mentioned is men. Yobi Yin. When she was minister in 2018, I think she was only in her early 30s, right?
Yeah.
And then she was pregnant on the job and everything, handled basically equivalent to 3 ministry portfolio.
Yeah.
She did really well, I think, you know, to handle that. I mean, she wrote an entire book about it as well. And I think you're looking at people who want to do things, usually in that age. Whether you are in your 50s, 60s, you are already, you know, I don't want to say past your prime, but you are not thinking in terms of innovation anymore, right?
We have to bring this or land this conversation. Are you optimistic, not just about 2026, but the direction of the country, both politically as well as economic-wise? Do you think that while there's, it goes without saying that there's a lot that needs to be done and there's a lot of institutional reforms that needs to be instituted, but are we moving towards a direction that you believe is the right way?
When you look at so-called radical reformers, whether it's Martin Luther King, whether it's Malcolm X ataupun orang-orang yang dianggap radical, people like Aru, for example, in PSM in Malaysia today, right? When you talk to them, although they always say about what's wrong with our society and all that, but they are actually very optimistic in person. And you almost have to be that way as an activist dan sebagainya because you believe another world is possible. Itu menggunakan tagline a left group lah, another world is possible. And I feel we have to embrace that mindset in this year and also beyond. What I see lah, satu danger lah is a lot of people when reform don't happen at the pace that they want, they just become jaded and cynical and take a back seat. And I think that's a very self-defeatist, you know, almost like self-fulfilling prophecy lah kan. If you think the system don't work and then you just give up, then of course it doesn't work lah kan. You have seen in New York City where, you know, Joran Mamdani basically energized, you know, new groups of people to, you know, be active in the political process and that leads to, you know, significant change. I think we need that mindset as well in Malaysia. There will not be one miracle in which kalau buat benda ni semua settle. You are in this in the long haul. And I was reading this book called Moral Ambition by Rutger Bregman. Fantastic book, I would recommend it. There's a superb quote in that says, it's not what you believe, it's what you're willing to do about it. So if you believe in a progressive society, inclusive Malaysia, economy yang lebih sama rata, you know, a poor person, whether you are, you know, poor Indian girl or a Malay Bumi Putra in Sabah Sarawak, you can come up to the very top. If you believe in that kind of society, what are you willing to do about it to bring about that society to reality?
That requires a lot by the person instead of just going about and whinge about the situation. We take charge and institute that kind of change ourselves. That is my aspiration as well because I don't like people complaining if they haven't done anything themselves. In fact, that is my exasperation sebenarnya. I would rather people do something and fail rather than whinge and not do anything, or not do anything and just whinge. So do you think that is a mindset or cultural shift that we have to espouse to everyone right now? If you want the change that you dream of, it's you that has to do it. Do you feel that is the moment of time right now?
Yeah, I mean, you know, almost 20 years ago now, a young person used to say to us, be the change that you want to be. Right?
Yeah.
2008. So I think that mindset, you know, basically shifting from a passive actor whereby things just happen to you to a more proactive actor in your life, right? Regardless of your role in society, but also in your life, right? Ni macam self-help lah pula kan. You know, it bring about the society that you want to see. Whether it's a, it doesn't have to be very big, right? It can be something you do in your neighborhood scale, for example, right? And so on. So I think it's something that, you know, you be the change that you want to be. Do even small things that will hopefully create a chain of effects.
What a way to end this conversation. Of course, it's a new year, new you, new me, and there's plenty of conversations like this that can be found on astroawani.com. But while the message is easy to say, it is very hard to do. But of course, if indeed you want to be the change that you are, then perhaps this is a good New Year's resolution to have. Until then, thanks very much for watching. You just heard from Ooi Kok Hin, the political and policy analyst. If you want to learn more, head on to our website and find out more of these conversations. You can find there as well. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.